When Margaret Chen received the letter about inheriting a house from a stranger, she thought someone was playing a cruel joke on a struggling widow, but standing in front of the 3-story Victorian mansion with her 2 young children clinging to her dress, she realized this wasn't just an unexpected inheritance, it was a lifeline she desperately needed. What she couldn't have known was that beneath the rotting floorboards of her new home lay evidence of crimes so horrific, so systematic, that exposing them would put her and her children in the crosshairs of the most dangerous conspiracy in American history. You're about to hear a story that sounds impossible, but I promise you every word is documented truth. The police reports exist. The FBI files are real. The court records are public. What happened to Margaret Chen and her children in Salem, Massachusetts, in 2019 proves that sometimes the most evil monsters are the ones who smile at you in broad daylight, who hold positions of trust and authority, who everyone believes are pillars of the community. Before we dive deeper into this nightmare, I want you to think about something. Look around your home right now. That place where your children sleep, where you feel safe, where you've built your life. Now imagine discovering that your sanctuary was built on top of a mass grave. Imagine learning that the walls you trusted to protect your family had witnessed horrors that would make seasoned detectives weep, because that's exactly what happened to Margaret. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why she can never sleep peacefully again. Margaret Chen was 34 years old when her world collapsed and then somehow rebuilt itself into something even more terrifying. She lived in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in Boston with her 8-year-old daughter, Emma, and her 5-year-old son, David. Her husband, Michael, had died 18 months earlier in a construction accident, leaving her with crushing medical debt and 2 children who kept asking when Daddy was coming home. Margaret worked as a librarian at the Boston Public Library, a job that barely covered rent and groceries, let alone the student loans from her master's degree in historical research or the credit card debt from Michael's final months in the hospital. She'd been surviving on food stamps and the kindness of neighbors, who sometimes watched the kids when she couldn't afford daycare. Every night, after putting Emma and David to bed in the single room they shared, Margaret would sit at her kitchen table calculating bills on the back of envelopes, trying to figure out which utilities she could let get disconnected without endangering her children. The eviction notice had arrived 3 days ago. She had until the end of the month to find $800 or find somewhere else to live. That's when the letter arrived. The envelope was expensive, cream-colored paper that felt foreign between Margaret's calloused fingers. The return address read Blackwood and Associates, Estate Law, Salem, Massachusetts. Margaret's first instinct was to throw it away. She'd received enough scam letters promising miracle solutions to recognize another one. But something about the weight of the paper, the formal wax seal, made her hesitate. She opened it carefully while Emma and David ate cereal for dinner again. Dear Ms. Chen, the letter began in elegant handwriting. We regret to inform you of the death of Mr. Elias Blackwood, who passed away on September 15, 2019. According to his last will and testament, you have been named as the sole beneficiary of his estate, including the property located at 1347 Elm Street, Salem, Massachusetts, along with all contents and a maintenance trust fund of $50,000. Margaret read the letter 4 times before the words penetrated her exhaustion. Elias Blackwood. She'd never heard the name in her life. She Googled him frantically on her cracked phone screen but found almost nothing. Just a brief obituary, listing him as a private historian and collector who had lived quietly in Salem for over 40 years. The law firm's phone number was real. Margaret called the next morning during her lunch break, her hands shaking as she spoke to a secretary who confirmed that yes, this was legitimate, and yes, Mr. Blackwood had specifically named Margaret Chen of Boston as his heir. But I don't understand, Margaret said, cradling the phone between her shoulder and ear while she helped a patron find genealogy records. I've never met this man. Why would he leave me anything? The secretary's voice grew uncomfortable. Mr. Blackwood left specific instructions that we were not to discuss his reasoning. He simply stated that you were the appropriate person for this inheritance. He did leave a personal letter for you, which we can only provide when you come to claim the property. Margaret hung up the phone feeling like she was dreaming. A house, a free house, with money for maintenance. After 18 months of choosing between electricity and groceries, someone had given her a home. She called in sick the next day and borrowed her neighbor Mrs. Rodriguez's car, promising to pay for gas when she got her next paycheck. Emma and David were excited about the adventure, chattering in the back seat about their new house as they drove north toward Salem. Is it going to be big, Mummy? Emma asked, her face pressed against the window as they passed through small New England towns. I don't know, sweetheart, Margaret replied honestly. We're going to see it together. David, always the more practical of her 2 children despite being only 5, asked, are we going to live there forever? Like, not move again? Margaret's heart clenched. They'd been evicted twice since Michael's death, sleeping in shelters and on friends' couches. David had learned not to get too attached to any place they stayed. I think so, buddy, Margaret said softly. I think this might be our home. The law office in Salem was housed in a building that looked older than America itself. Old dark wood and brass fixtures that spoke of old money and older secrets. Mr. Hendricks, the lawyer handling the estate, was a nervous man with darting eyes who kept glancing at his watch as if he had somewhere more important to be. The property has been in the Blackwood family since 1847, he explained, sliding papers across his desk while Emma and David sat quietly in chairs that were too big for them. Elias was the last of his line. The house is substantial. It will need work, of course, but the trust fund should cover basic repairs and maintenance. Why did he choose me? Margaret asked for the second time, watching her children look around the formal office with wide eyes. Mr. Hendricks shifted uncomfortably and handed her a sealed envelope with her name written in the same elegant script as the original letter. He left this for you. He was very specific that you should read it alone, at the house itself. Dr. 1347 Elm Street took them through Salem's historic district, past the tourist attractions and into older residential neighborhoods, where the trees grew taller and the houses grew larger and more isolated. When Margaret finally pulled into the circular driveway of her inherited property, she had to catch her breath. The house was enormous. 3 stories of Victorian Gothic architecture that looked like something from a fairy tale, if fairy tales were written by people who understood that happy endings were rare and usually came with a terrible price. The wraparound porch sagged under its own ornate weight, and paint peeled from the wooden siding in long strips that fluttered like skin. Several windows were boarded up, while others showed only darkness behind cracked glass. But underneath the decay, Margaret could see the bones of something magnificent. This wasn't just a house, it was a manor, a place where her children could have their own rooms, where she could have space to breathe, where they could finally stop running from one temporary shelter to another. Wow, Emma breathed, staring up at the tower room that crowned the 3rd floor. It's like a castle, Mummy, a scary castle, David added, but he didn't sound frightened. He sounded intrigued. Margaret climbed the porch steps carefully, testing each board before trusting it with her weight. The front door was solid oak, surprisingly well preserved despite everything else. The key from the lawyer turned smoothly in an ornate lock that looked like it belonged in a museum. The interior was a time capsule. Heavy furniture covered in white sheets dominated rooms that were larger than Margaret's entire Boston apartment. Dark wood paneling absorbed what little light filtered through grimy windows, and the air carried scents of dust, old wood, and something else, something sweet and cloying that made Margaret wrinkle her nose. Can we explore, Mummy? Emma asked, her voice echoing in the vast entryway. Stay together, Margaret instructed, and don't touch anything until we know what condition everything is in. They moved through the ground floor like tourists in a museum. The living room had a fireplace large enough for Margaret to stand inside. The dining room table could seat 12 people comfortably. The kitchen looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1950s, but it was spacious and had good bones. Emma was fascinated by a grand piano in what appeared to be a music room, its keys yellowed with age but still producing haunting notes when she pressed them gently. David was more interested in the library, where floor-to-ceiling bookshelves held volumes that looked older than anything they'd seen in the Boston Public Library. It was in the library that Margaret decided to open Elias Blackwood's letter. She settled into a leather chair by one of the tall windows while her children continued exploring under her watchful eye. The letter was written in the same careful script as the first communication, but this time the formality was replaced by something more urgent, more personal. Dear Margaret, it began, if you are reading this, I am dead, and you are wondering why a stranger has entrusted you with the burden I could no longer carry alone. The truth is both simpler and more terrible than you can imagine. I know about your husband. I know about the accident, the medical bills, the way you've been struggling to provide for Emma and David. I know because I have been researching, looking for someone with both the strength to handle what I must reveal and the motivation to see justice done. This house holds secrets that powerful people have killed to protect. What you will discover here will challenge everything you believe about justice, about the safety of children, about the nature of evil itself. I have chosen you because your work as a historical researcher has prepared you to document and preserve truth, even when that truth is unbearable. I chose you because you are a mother, because you understand that some things are worth any risk if they protect children from monsters. But I must warn you, once you begin to uncover what lies beneath this house, and you will uncover it, because I am leaving you clues that will make discovery inevitable, your life and the lives of your children will change forever. There are people in positions of power who have spent decades ensuring that certain secrets stay buried. They will kill to keep those secrets. Margaret, they will kill you, and they will kill your children. The trust fund I have left you is not just for house repairs. It is for protection. Use it to install security systems, to hire bodyguards if necessary, to relocate quickly if you must. But most importantly, use it to ensure that what you find reaches the right people, federal investigators who cannot be bought, journalists who cannot be intimidated, prosecutors who care more about justice than their careers. There is a loose floorboard in the basement, beneath the old coal furnace. Start there. But Margaret, I beg you, do not let your children be present when you make this discovery. What you find there should never be seen by innocent eyes. When you find them, remember that they were someone's Emma, someone's David. They deserved better than what they received in this house. with profound apologies for the burden I place upon you, and with hope that you will succeed where I failed. Elias Blackwood P.S. Trust no one in Salem until you know the full truth. The corruption reaches deeper than you can imagine. Margaret's hands shook as she finished reading. The letter raised more questions than it answered, but the implications were clear enough to make her stomach clench with fear. Something terrible had happened in this house. Something involving children. The rational part of her mind said to pack up her kids immediately, drive back to Boston, and let someone else deal with whatever secrets Elias Blackwood had been too afraid to face. But the practical part of her mind, the part that had been counting pennies for 18 months, the part that was tired of her children sleeping on air mattresses in other people's living rooms, whispered that she couldn't afford to walk away from this house, no matter what it might contain. And there was something else. The part of her that had become a historical researcher because she believed truth mattered, because she couldn't stand the thought of important stories being lost or covered up. That part of her was already planning her trip to the basement. "Mommy, there are more stairs," David called from the hallway, his voice echoing from what sounded like a considerable distance. Margaret folded the letter carefully and put it in her purse. Whatever Elias Blackwood had discovered, it would have to wait until she could explore alone. Right now, her priority was making sure this house was safe for her children. She found Emma and David at the top of a narrow staircase that led to the second floor. The hallway stretched longer than seemed possible, lined with doors that led to bedrooms larger than most people's entire apartments. "This one could be mine," Emma said, standing in the doorway of a room with built-in bookshelves and a window seat that looked out over the garden. "And this one's mine," David declared from across the hall, in a room that featured a small fireplace, and what appeared to be a secret passage behind a movable bookshelf. Margaret looked at her children's excited faces and felt her heart break a little. They'd never had their own rooms before. In Boston, they'd been sharing a space barely large enough for bunk beds, their toys stored in plastic bins that doubled as tables because there was no other furniture space. "We'll need to check everything first," Margaret said carefully. "Make sure the floors are safe, the windows work, everything is clean. This house has been empty for a while." But privately, she was already imagining Emma reading in that window seat, David building fortresses with the books from his secret passage. This house could give her children the childhood she'd been unable to provide since Michael's death: space to play, rooms of their own, a place that belonged to them instead of landlords who could evict them on a whim. She just had to figure out what to do about whatever was hidden in the basement. They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the upper floors. The third floor contained what had once been servants' quarters, now empty but full of interesting architectural details that fascinated both children. The tower room at the very top was accessed by a narrow spiral staircase and offered a view of Salem that stretched for miles. "We could see everything from up here," Emma observed, pressing her face against the tower's windows. "Like a watchtower," David added. "We could watch for bad guys." Margaret felt a chill at her son's words. According to Elias Blackwood's letter, there were bad guys, people who had killed to protect the secrets hidden in this house. And if she chose to stay, if she chose to uncover those secrets, her children might indeed need a WATCHTOWER. As evening approached, Margaret made a decision that would change all their lives forever. They would stay the night in the house. She would put the children to bed in sleeping bags on the second floor, wait until they were asleep, and then investigate the basement alone. She told herself she was just satisfying her curiosity, just making sure the house was safe before they moved in permanently. But deep down, Margaret knew she was lying to herself. She was about to open a door that could never be closed again, and whatever she found on the other side would determine whether her children would finally have a real home, or whether they would spend the rest of their lives running from people who killed to keep secrets buried. The basement door was hidden behind a curtain near the kitchen, just as Elias had described in his house notes. Margaret waited until 11 p.m., when she was certain Emma and David were deeply asleep upstairs, before opening that door and descending into the darkness that would change everything. The basement was larger than the house's footprint should have allowed, extending under what must have been the garden and possibly the neighboring property. The walls were original stone, and the floor was hard-packed dirt that felt wrong under her feet, too soft in some places, too hard in others, as if the ground had been disturbed and repacked multiple times over many years. The old coal furnace squatted in one corner like a metal monster, its pipes reaching through the ceiling like iron fingers. And there, exactly where Elias had said it would be, was a floorboard that sat slightly higher than the others, as if something underneath was pushing it up. Margaret pried the board loose with a screwdriver she'd found in the kitchen. Underneath was a metal box wrapped in oilcloth, and inside that box was evidence of evil that would haunt her nightmares for the rest of her life. Photographs, dozens of them, black and white and clearly old. Children's faces stared back at her, boys and girls between the ages of 8 and 15, their eyes wide with terror. These weren't family photos or school pictures. These children were bound, gagged, injured, and in the background of several photos, Margaret could see parts of the basement around her, the same stone walls, the same dirt floor. But what made her drop the box, scattering the photos across the basement floor like horrible confetti, were the dates written on the back of each image. They spanned 60 years. From 1959 to 2018, someone had been taking children, bringing them to this basement, and photographing them for 6 decades. At the bottom of the box was a journal bound in leather that had once been black but was now faded to brown. Margaret opened it with trembling hands and immediately wished she hadn't. The handwriting was elegant, educated, the same script she'd seen in formal legal documents, but the content was the ravings of a monster. December 3, 1963. The girl lasted 3 days longer than expected. Her screams finally stopped this morning. The soundproofing Mrs. Blackwood installed is working perfectly. No complaints from the neighbors this time. The body has joined the others in the eastern section. I must remember to lime the area more thoroughly next spring. Margaret slammed the journal shut, her stomach lurching violently. She scrambled backward, knocking over the metal box, her mind reeling with the implications of what she'd found. This wasn't just evidence of murder. It was evidence of systematic, long-term torture and killing of children, documented like a business ledger by someone who had treated human suffering as entertainment, and according to the dates, it had been happening until just last year. Margaret grabbed her phone to call 911, but stopped when she remembered Elias Blackwood's warning: trust no one in Salem until you know the full truth. If this had been going on for 60 years, if children had been disappearing and dying in this basement for generations, then someone in local law enforcement had to have been involved in covering it up. She was still crouched in the basement, surrounded by evidence of unspeakable crimes, when she heard the front door of the house open upstairs. Heavy footsteps moved through the main floor, accompanied by a man's voice calling out, "Mrs. Chen, this is Deputy Sheriff Williams. We had a report of suspicious activity at this address. Are you and your children safe?" Margaret's blood turned to ice. She hadn't told anyone they were staying at the house tonight. The law firm thought they were coming back tomorrow. Her neighbor in Boston thought they were visiting relatives. No one should have known they were here, which meant Deputy Sheriff Williams wasn't here to help. He was here because someone had been watching the house, waiting to see if the new owner would discover what Elias Blackwood had hidden in the basement. Above her, she could hear the footsteps moving methodically through the house, searching room by room. Soon, he would reach the second floor where Emma and David were sleeping. Margaret looked at the scattered photographs, at the journal documenting 60 years of child murder, at the evidence that could finally bring justice for dozens of victims. Then she thought about her children upstairs, innocent and vulnerable and completely dependent, or her to protect them from the monsters that Elias Blackwood had warned her about. She made a decision that would save all their lives and ultimately expose one of the most horrific conspiracies in American history. Instead of trying to run or hide, Margaret Chen gathered up every piece of evidence she could carry and prepared to fight for the truth that could finally set 60 years of stolen children free. But first, she had to save Emma and David from becoming the next victims in a basement that had already claimed too many young lives. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she heard Deputy Williams climbing the stairs to the second floor where Emma and David slept. Every maternal instinct screamed at her to run upstairs and put herself between this man and her children. But she forced herself to think strategically. If she revealed herself now, they would all die. The evidence scattered around the basement proved that whoever had been killing children for 60 years had law enforcement protection. Her only advantage was that Williams didn't know she'd found the evidence yet. He was probably here to check whether the new owner had discovered anything, maybe to plant some story about dangerous structural damage that would force her to leave. If she could stay hidden long enough for him to search and leave, she might have time to figure out how to protect her children and expose the truth. Margaret quietly gathered the photographs and journal, stuffing them into the metal box along with several loose floorboards that might contain more evidence. The basement had multiple dark corners where decades of stored furniture created shadows deep enough to hide in. She crept toward the farthest corner, behind an old coal bin that blocked most of the light from the single bulb hanging near the stairs. Above her, she could hear Williams moving through the bedrooms. His footsteps paused outside what must be Emma's room, and Margaret's blood turned to acid as she imagined him standing over her sleeping daughter. But after a long moment, the footsteps moved on to David's room, then to the other bedrooms. Margaret pressed herself deeper into the shadows and tried to control her breathing. The basement smelled of damp earth and something else, something sweet and rotting, that she now understood was the smell of death, of children who had died in this place and been buried beneath her feet. She could hear Williams moving back downstairs, his search becoming more methodical, kitchen cupboards opening and closing, furniture being moved. He was looking for something specific, and Margaret had a horrible feeling she knew what it was. The basement door opened, and light from the kitchen spilled down the wooden stairs. Williams' heavy boots descended slowly, and Margaret could see his silhouette in the doorway, a large man with something in his hand that caught the light. "A gun. I know you're down there," Mrs. Chen. Williams called into the darkness. His voice had dropped all pretense of friendly concern. "Your car's in the driveway. Your children are asleep upstairs, and the basement door was open. You've seen something you shouldn't have seen." Margaret held her breath, praying that the shadows were deep enough to hide her. Williams stepped fully into the basement, and she could see his face now, not the face of a concerned police officer, but the face of a predator who had been protecting other predators for years, you know. Elias Blackwood thought he was so clever, Williams continued, moving deeper into the basement with his gun raised, leaving his little treasure hunt for some bleeding heart librarian. Did you really think you were the first person he tried to recruit? He approached 3 other people over the years, social workers, journalists, even a federal prosecutor. They all had unfortunate accidents before they could cause trouble. Margaret's throat constricted. Elias hadn't just been afraid to expose the truth himself, he'd tried to find someone else to do it, and those people had been murdered for getting too close. The thing is, Williams said, kicking over boxes and furniture as he searched, this basement has been cleaned multiple times over the years. What you found tonight, those photos, that journal, those are just mementos. The real evidence, the evidence that could actually hurt important people, that was destroyed decades ago. He was lying, Margaret realized. If the evidence was worthless, he wouldn't be here with a gun trying to kill her for finding it. The photographs and journal were more dangerous than he was pretending, which meant they were worth dying to protect. But even mementos can cause problems if they end up in the wrong hands, Williams continued. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to give me everything you found, and then you're going to have a tragic accident. Unstable woman, overwhelmed by grief, brings her children to an abandoned house and dies in a basement collapse. Very sad. The children will be placed in foster care, where they'll be well taken care of. The way he said well taken care of made Margaret's skin crawl. She thought about the photographs, about children who had trusted adults and been betrayed in the worst possible way. Williams wasn't just talking about killing her, he was talking about putting Emma and David into a system where they could be selected as victims. Margaret looked around desperately for another way out. The basement had a coal chute that led to the outside, but it was boarded up and would make too much noise to break through. The stairs were the only exit, and Williams was blocking them. But then she remembered something from her exploration. Earlier, David had mentioned a secret passage behind the bookshelf in his chosen bedroom. If the house had one hidden passage, it might have others. Old houses like this were often built with servants' passages connecting different floors, moving as quietly as she could. Margaret began exploring the basement's back wall, running her hands along the stone looking for irregularities. Williams was still searching the other end of the basement, overturning furniture and growing more frustrated with each empty corner. Her fingers found what felt like a wooden doorframe, hidden behind a stack of moldering books. She pushed gently, and the panel swung inward, revealing a narrow passage that led upward. It was barely wide enough for an adult to squeeze through, probably designed for servants to move between floors without being seen by the family. Margaret grabbed a metal box containing the evidence and slipped into the passage, pulling the hidden door closed behind her just as Williams' flashlight beam swept across the area where she'd been hiding. The passage was pitch black and smelled of dust and mice, but it led upward through the walls of the house. Margaret climbed carefully, feeling her way in the darkness, praying that the old wooden steps would hold her weight. She could hear Williams below, shouting in frustration as he realized she'd escaped. Soon he would start searching the main floors again, and when he couldn't find her, he would start looking for ways out of the basement that he'd missed. The passage emerged behind a panel in the library, exactly where Margaret had read Eliza's letter earlier that evening. She pushed the panel open carefully and stepped into the room, her heart still racing from the close call. But her relief was short. She could hear Williams climbing the basement stairs, his boots heavy on the wooden steps. He would search the main floor systematically, and eventually he would find her. Worse, he knew her children were upstairs, and if he couldn't find Margaret, he might decide to use Emma and David as leverage. Margaret looked at the evidence box in her hands and made a decision that would save all their lives. She couldn't run. Williams would catch them before they reached the car. She couldn't hide. He knew the house and would eventually find any hiding place, but she could fight back. She opened the box and pulled out the journal, flipping through pages of carefully documented murder until she found what she was looking for. Names. The journal didn't just record Edmund Blackwood's crimes. It recorded his customers, his protectors, his entire network of accomplices, politicians, judges, business leaders, law enforcement officials. The journal listed them all, along with dates, payments, and specific services provided. Margaret recognized several names from newspapers and television, people who were still alive, still in positions of power. This wasn't just evidence of past crimes, it was evidence of an ongoing conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. And Margaret suddenly understood why Williams was so desperate to kill her. She wasn't just threatening to expose a serial killer who had died years ago. She was threatening to topple an entire network of powerful pedophiles who had been protected for decades. Margaret pulled out her phone and began photographing pages of the journal, uploading them to a cloud storage account as fast as her phone could process the images. If Williams killed her tonight, at least the evidence would survive. But as she worked, you could hear him moving through the house, calling out in a voice that was trying to sound reasonable. "Mrs. Chen, let's be rational about this," he called from the kitchen. "You have 2 young children to think about. Don't you want to protect them? Don't you want them to have a future?" The threat was clear. Cooperate or watch your children die. Margaret finished photographing the most important pages and sent copies. 3 different email accounts, including one belonging to a journalist she'd worked with during her research on missing persons cases. Then she called 911. "This is Margaret Chen at 1347 Elm Street in Salem," she whispered into the phone. "There is a man with a gun in my house threatening to kill me and my children. He says he's a deputy sheriff, but I don't think he's here officially. Please send help." "Ma'am, are you sure this person is actually law enforcement?" the dispatcher asked. "He has a badge and a gun, but he's threatening to murder my family to cover up evidence of child killings that happened in this house. Please contact the Massachusetts State Police, not Salem local police. I have evidence that Salem law enforcement is compromised." Margaret knew she was taking a huge risk. If the state police were also part of the conspiracy, she was signing her own death warrant. But she had to believe that the corruption hadn't spread to every level of law enforcement. "State police are being notified," the dispatcher said. "Can you and your children get to a safe location in the house while you wait for help?" Margaret looked toward the ceiling, thinking about Emma and David sleeping innocently 2 floors above. "I need to get to my children first." She made her way to the servants' staircase, the narrow passage she'd discovered earlier that connected all 3 floors without being visible from the main hallways. Williams was still searching the first floor, growing more agitated as he failed to find her. Margaret climbed to the 2nd floor and slipped into Emma's room. Her daughter was sleeping peacefully, curled up in her sleeping bag with a stuffed rabbit she'd had since she was a baby. Margaret shook her gently awake. "Emma, sweetheart, we need to play a quiet game," Margaret whispered. "There's a man in the house who wants to hurt us, so we need to hide until the police come." Emma's eyes went wide, but she'd learned during their months of homelessness that sometimes adults needed children to be brave and quiet. She nodded and gathered her things without making a sound. They crept across the hall to David's room, where Margaret repeated the process. David was always a heavy sleeper, but he came awake instantly when he heard the word hide. Living in shelters and temporary housing had taught both children that sometimes hiding was the difference between safety and danger. Margaret led them to the tower room on the 3rd floor, the highest point in the house with the best view of the surrounding area. It also had something the other rooms didn't, a landline telephone that was connected to a different system than the house's main line. While Emma and David huddled together in the corner, Margaret called the journalist she'd sent the photographs to, hoping he would answer his phone at midnight. "Tom, this is Margaret Chen. I'm sending you the biggest story of your career, but I need you to act on it immediately. I'm trapped in a house in Salem with my children, being hunted by a corrupt sheriff's deputy who's trying to cover up 60 years of systematic child murder." Tom Patterson had worked with Margaret on several historical research projects, and he knew she wasn't prone to exaggeration or conspiracy theories. "Margaret, what the hell are you talking about? Check your email. I sent you photographs of a journal documenting the torture and murder of children spanning 6 decades, including a list of prominent people who participated. The evidence is real, Tom, and if this deputy kills me tonight, you're the only person who can make sure the truth gets out." "Jesus Christ," Tom breathed. "Margaret, where exactly are you?" "I'm calling the FBI, 1347 Elm Street, Salem, Massachusetts." "But Tom, don't trust local law enforcement. This conspiracy involves police, judges, politicians. It goes all the way to the top of Massachusetts government." Through the tower room's windows, Margaret could see flashing lights approaching in the distance. Either state police were responding to her 911 call, or more corrupt officers were arriving to help Williams clean up the mess. "The police are here," Margaret whispered into the phone. "Tom, if something happens to me, promise me you'll publish everything. These children deserve justice, and there are probably more victims out there right now." "Margaret, I promise. But you and your kids are going to be fine. You've exposed them, they can't cover this up anymore." Margaret hoped he was right, but as she watched multiple police cars surround the house, she realized that the most dangerous part of her night was just beginning. She was about to find out whether the cavalry had arrived, or whether she had just called more wolves to the slaughter. She gathered Emma and David close to her, looking down at their trusting faces, and promised them silently that no matter what happened next, she would make sure the truth about this house would finally come to light. Too many children had died in that basement for their deaths to be meaningless. The real battle for justice was about to begin. Margaret pressed her children closer against the tower room's curved wall as the police car surrounded the house below. Through the circular windows, she could count at least 6 vehicles, their red and blue lights painting the Victorian mansion in ghostly colors that made it look even more like something from a nightmare. But something was wrong with the scene unfolding below. Instead of officers rushing to secure the perimeter and rescue the family inside, she watched the vehicles park in a coordinated pattern that looked more like a siege than a rescue operation. The officers who emerged moved with the precision of a military unit, not the urgency of cops responding to a domestic emergency. "Mommy, why are there so many police cars?" Emma whispered, her 8-year-old voice barely audible even in the silence of the tower room. "Because the bad man downstairs called his friends," David said with the matter-of-fact wisdom of a 5-year-old who had learned that adults couldn't always be trusted to protect children. Margaret's heart sank as she realized David was probably right. Williams hadn't been acting alone when he came to the house tonight. He'd been part of a coordinated response to eliminate the new owner before she could discover what Elias Blackwood had hidden in the basement. When Margaret escaped his initial attempt to silence her, he'd called for backup. The landline telephone in the tower room rang, its old-fashioned bell echoing through the curved walls like a death knell. Margaret stared at it for 3 rings, before picking up, knowing that whatever voice she heard on the other end would probably determine whether her children lived through the night. Mrs. Chen. The voice was calm, professional, with just a hint of Boston accent. My name is Agent Sarah Morrison, Federal Bureau of Investigation. We received your emergency call through State Police Dispatch, and we're currently establishing a perimeter around your location. Margaret felt a surge of hope, but forced herself to remain cautious. How do I know you're really FBI? How do I know you're not part of whatever conspiracy killed children in this house? That's exactly the right question to ask, Morrison replied, her voice carrying approval rather than irritation. Tom Patterson contacted our Boston field office 20 minutes ago with photographs you sent him. We've been investigating reports of missing children in the Salem area for 3 years, but we never had evidence connecting local law enforcement to the disappearances. What you found tonight confirms our worst fears about corruption in Massachusetts state and local government. Margaret looked down at the cluster of police vehicles and officers below. Then why are there so many local cops surrounding my house? If they're corrupt, why would you work with them? We're not working with them, Morrison said grimly. Those officers down there responded to a call about a federal fugitive hiding in an abandoned house with stolen children. They think they're here to arrest a kidnapper. They don't know we're here, and they don't know what you really found tonight. The implications hit Margaret like a physical blow. Williams hadn't just called for backup, he'd orchestrated a cover story that would justify killing her and taking her children. When federal investigators tried to piece together what happened, they would find reports showing that Margaret Chen had been a kidnapper who died resisting arrest, and Emma and David would disappear into a system that Williams controlled. Agent Morrison, my children and I are trapped in the tower room on the 3rd floor. There's a corrupt deputy named Williams somewhere in the house, and he's been trying to kill me to cover up evidence of child murders that span 60 years. We know about Williams, Morrison said. He's actually not just a deputy. He's been running interference for a network of criminals that includes some very prominent people whose names appeared in the journal you photographed. Margaret, I need you to understand something. What you uncovered tonight isn't just about Salem. It's about a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of state and federal government. Through the tower room windows, Margaret could see the local officers taking positions around the house. But now she also noticed other figures moving in the shadows beyond the police perimeter. People in dark clothing who weren't part of the official response, but who were clearly coordinating with someone. Agent Morrison, there are other people out there. Not police. They're surrounding the police cars. Morrison's voice became urgent. Margaret, we need to get you and your children out of that house immediately. The local officers down there aren't all corrupt, but they're about to walk into an ambush. Williams' people are going to eliminate everyone on the scene and make it look like a drug raid gone wrong. Margaret felt the world spinning around her. Not only were her children in danger, but innocent police officers were about to die because she'd uncovered evidence that powerful people would kill to protect. What do you need me to do? There's a federal SWAT team approaching from the north side of the property, but they need time to get into position. You need to warn the local officers that they're walking into a trap, but you can't use the house phone. Williams is probably monitoring all the lines. Margaret looked at her cell phone. No signal. The stone walls of the tower room were possibly signal jamming equipment that had cut off her connection to the outside world. I can't call out on my cell phone, she told Morrison. Then you'll have to get their attention another way. Margaret, I know this is asking a lot, but you might be the only person who can prevent a massacre tonight. Margaret looked at Emma and David, both watching her with the kind of trust that only children can maintain even in the face of absolute terror. Everything in her maternal instincts screamed at her to keep them hidden, to protect them from the violence that was about to erupt around the house. But she thought about the photographs scattered in the basement, about children who had trusted adults to protect them and been betrayed in the most horrible ways possible. She thought about the officers outside who had no idea they were about to die for stumbling into something much larger and more dangerous than a simple rescue operation. Emma, David, listen to me very carefully, Margaret said, kneeling down to look directly into their eyes. Mommy has to go downstairs for a few minutes to help some people who are in danger. I need you to stay in this room, lock the door behind me, and don't open it for anyone except me. If someone else tries to come in, you hide in that closet and don't make any sound until I come back. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded solemnly. Are you going to fight the bad men, Mommy? I'm going to try to save the good people, Margaret replied. And then we're all going to go somewhere safe and make sure the bad men can never hurt any more children. David wrapped his arms around Margaret's neck. Come back, Mummy, don't be like Daddy. The words hit Margaret harder than any physical blow, but they also gave her the strength she needed. Michael had died in an accident, but her children would not become orphans because she was too afraid to act when action could save lives. Margaret kissed both children and locked them in the tower room, then made her way down through the house using the servants' passages that had already saved her life once tonight. She could hear Williams moving through the main floor, apparently still searching for her, unaware that she'd been communicating with federal agents. The house's main electrical panel was in the basement, and Margaret had noticed during her earlier exploration that it controlled not just the interior lighting but also the exterior floodlights that illuminated the entire property. If she could get to that panel and start flashing the lights in a pattern that would alert the officers outside, she might be able to warn them before the ambush began. But reaching the basement meant getting past Williams, and the servants' passages only connected to the main floors through the library. She would have to cross open space where he could see her. Margaret crept through the passage until she reached the library panel, then listened carefully for any sign of Williams' location. She could hear him in the kitchen, apparently talking on his radio to coordinate with the officers outside. Moving as quietly as she could, Margaret slipped into the library and made her way toward the basement door. But as she reached the hallway, Williams' voice stopped her cold. "Base, this is Williams. I've been through the house twice, and there's no sign of the subject or the stolen children. She must have found another way out." Stolen children. He was maintaining the fiction that Emma and David were kidnapping victims, not Margaret's own kids. "Copy that, Williams," came the response through his radio. "Perimeter team reports no movement around the exterior. Continue searching. Federal agents are requesting access to the scene, but we're maintaining local jurisdiction for now." Margaret, they realized that Agent Morrison's FBI team was being kept away from the house by local authorities who thought they were protecting an ongoing operation. The federal agents who could save everyone were being blocked by the very people they were trying to rescue. She had to get to that electrical panel. Margaret waited until she heard Williams climbing the stairs to search the upper floors again, then sprinted for the basement door. The wooden steps creaked under her feet, but she reached the electrical panel quickly and began studying the switches. The exterior floodlights were controlled by a main breaker that she could flip on and off rapidly. If she could create a pattern, maybe SOS in Morse code, the officers outside might realize something was wrong and take defensive positions before the ambush began. Margaret began flashing the lights. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short SOS. She repeated the pattern 5 times, then switched to flashing random patterns that would clearly indicate someone inside was trying to communicate through the basement's small windows. She could see the officers outside reacting to the light show. Some were pointing at the house, others were talking rapidly into their radios. At least a few of them were smart enough to realize that normal electrical problems don't create Morse code patterns. But Margaret's relief was short. Heavy footsteps on the basement stairs told her that Williams had heard her moving around and tracked her to her location. "Very clever," Mrs. Chen, Williams said as he descended into the basement with his gun drawn. "But you're too late. The federal agents are being turned away, and my associates outside are already in position. In about 5 minutes, everyone on this property is going to be dead except for you and your children, and you'll be dead shortly after that." Margaret backed away from the electrical panel, but there was nowhere to run in the basement. Williams had her trapped exactly where this nightmare had begun. "You know what the beautiful irony is," Williams continued, moving closer with his weapon trained on her chest. "Your husband Michael didn't die in a construction accident. He was getting too close to our operation through his work on city planning projects. He'd started asking questions about why certain properties were off limits for development, why some areas had restricted access even for infrastructure work." Margaret's world tilted on its axis. Michael's death hadn't been an accident. He'd been murdered, just like all the other people who had gotten too close to the truth. "His death was supposed to end the threat," Williams said with cold satisfaction. "But then you inherited this house and started poking around where you didn't belong. It's almost like Elias Blackwood planned it this way." Margaret thought about Elias's letter, about his apology for the burden he was placing on her. He hadn't chosen her randomly, he'd chosen her specifically because her husband had already been killed trying to expose the same conspiracy. This had been Elias's attempt to ensure that Michael's death would finally lead to justice. "The children in those photographs," Margaret said, backing toward the coal bin where she'd hidden earlier. "How many families have you destroyed? How many parents have spent years wondering what happened to their kids?" Williams shrugged. "Enough to keep very important people happy and very quiet. You can't imagine the kind of control you gain when you have video evidence of prominent citizens participating in the torture and murder of children, judges who owe you favors, politicians who vote the way you want them to, business leaders who award contracts to your associates. It's the most effective form of leverage ever invented." Margaret realized she was hearing a confession to not just murder, but to systematic blackmail and corruption that had probably influenced countless court cases, elections, and business deals over the past 60 years. "But the best part," Williams continued, "is that it's sustainable. Every few months we acquire new inventory, runaways, foster kids, children from families too poor or powerless to make their disappearances a priority. The customers get their entertainment, we get our leverage, and the world keeps turning. New inventory. He was talking about children as if they were products to be consumed. Margaret's hand found something behind the coal bin, a loose piece of metal pipe, probably left over from old plumbing repairs. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was better than facing him empty-handed. Your children will make excellent additions to our program, Williams said with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. 8 and 5 are perfect ages, old enough to understand what's happening to them, young enough to be completely helpless. The customers pay premium rates for siblings. The rage that filled Margaret at those words was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was pure, focused, maternal fury that burned away every trace of fear and hesitation. This man was talking about torturing and killing Emma and David for the entertainment of wealthy pedophiles. Margaret gripped the metal pipe and prepared to fight for her children's lives with everything she had. "You're never going to touch my children," she said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. Williams laughed. "Mrs. Chen, you're a librarian with a piece of scrap metal. I'm a trained law enforcement officer with a gun and 20 years of experience killing people who threaten our operation. How exactly do you think this ends?" Margaret looked at the evidence scattered around the basement, at the photographs of children who had died because no one had been brave enough or strong enough to save them. She thought about Emma and David locked in the tower room above, trusting her to come back to them. "It ends with the truth finally coming out," Margaret said, "and it ends with justice for every child who died in this basement." The final confrontation between a mother protecting her children and a killer protecting his conspiracy was about to begin. But Margaret was no longer the frightened widow who had inherited a house from a stranger. She was a woman who had discovered the worst evil imaginable and chosen to fight it, regardless of the cost. The battle for justice and for Emma and David's lives was about to reach its climax. The metal pipe felt cold and inadequate in Margaret's hands as Deputy Williams raised his service weapon, pointing it directly at her chest. In the dim light of the basement that had witnessed 60 years of child murder, a librarian and a killer faced each other in what would determine whether the truth about this house would finally emerge or remain buried forever along with Margaret's family. But before Williams could pull the trigger, the entire house shook with the force of multiple explosions. Dust rained from the ceiling as windows shattered upstairs, and the lights flickered wildly before going out completely, plunging the basement into absolute darkness. "What the hell?" Williams spun toward the stairs, his weapon sweeping in confusion as emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in hellish red light. Margaret didn't hesitate. She swung the metal pipe with every ounce of strength she possessed, connecting with Williams' gun hand just as muzzle flashes erupted from outside the house. His weapon discharged into the basement wall, the sound deafening in the confined space. But the gun flew from his grasp and clattered across the dirt floor above them. Automatic weapon fire erupted like deadly thunder. Margaret could hear men shouting, glass breaking, and what sounded like a war zone developing around the Victorian house that had already seen too much violence. "You bitch!" Williams lunged for his fallen weapon, but Margaret was closer. She kicked the gun away from his reaching fingers and swung the pipe again, this time catching him across the ribs with a crack that suggested broken bones. Williams rolled away from her, gasping in pain but far from defeated, even injured. He was larger, stronger, and trained in combat. Margaret's advantage of surprise was already fading. "The federal agents," Williams snarled, struggling to his feet. "Morrison's team must have decided to move in despite local jurisdiction. But it doesn't matter. My people outside have them outnumbered and outgunned." More explosions shook the house, and Margaret could smell smoke beginning to filter down from the upper floors. Whatever battle was raging outside had apparently moved inside, and the house was catching fire. "Emma and David," Margaret whispered, looking toward the ceiling. Her children were trapped 3 floors above in a house that was burning around them. Williams saw her moment of distraction and tackled her, both of them crashing into the stone wall with bone-jarring force. Margaret's pipe went spinning away into the darkness as Williams' hands found her throat. "Should have minded your own business," he hissed, his fingers tightening around her neck. "Should have taken the house and been grateful for your good fortune. Now your kids are going to die in a fire, and everyone will blame the federal agents for botching a rescue operation." Margaret clawed at his hands, but her vision was already starting to tunnel as his grip cut off her air supply. She could hear the sounds of battle intensifying above them, could smell the smoke getting thicker, but all that mattered was that Emma and David were somewhere in that inferno and she was about to die without saving them. But then she remembered something Williams had said earlier. The customers paid premium rates for siblings. He wasn't just planning to kill her children in the fire, he was planning to get them out, to add them to his inventory of victims for the network's wealthy clients. That realization gave Margaret strength born of absolute desperation. She stopped trying to pry his fingers away from her throat and instead drove her knee upward with every ounce of force she could muster, catching Williams directly between the legs. His grip loosened as he doubled over in agony, and Margaret broke free, gasping for air and scrambling toward the basement stairs. But Williams recovered faster than she'd hoped, grabbing her ankle and pulling her back down into the basement. "You're not going anywhere," he snarled, and neither are your children. After tonight, Emma and David Chen are going to disappear completely. They'll become new people with new names, and their new lives will be very, very different from anything you could have given them. Margaret kicked at his face with her free foot, feeling her heel connect with his nose in a spray of blood. Williams released her ankle with a curse, and she scrambled up the stairs as fast as she could climb. The main floor of the house was a war zone. Smoke filled the air, making it hard to see and harder to breathe. Bullet holes had shattered windows and walls, and small fires were spreading through rooms that had been beautiful just hours ago. Margaret could hear voices shouting tactical commands, but she couldn't tell which were friendly and which were trying to kill her family. She made it halfway to the servants' staircase before she heard Williams behind her, climbing out of the basement with murder in his voice. Fire department's been told to stay back due to active shooter situation, he called after her. Federal agents are pinned down outside. There's no cavalry coming to save you, Mrs. Chen. Just you and me and your children. And a house that's going to burn down with everyone inside it. Margaret reached the servants' passage and started climbing toward the third floor, but the narrow stairway was filling with smoke that made her eyes water and her lungs burn. She could hear Emma and David calling for her from the tower room, their young voices tight with fear but still trusting that Mommy would come back for them. "I'm coming, babies," Margaret shouted back, taking the steps 3 at a time despite the smoke and the sound of Williams pursuing her through the burning house. But when she reached the third floor landing, she found the hallway blocked by fallen beams and spreading fire. The route to the tower room was impassable, and she could hear Williams climbing the servants' stairs behind her with the determination of a man who had killed many times before and wouldn't hesitate to kill again. Margaret looked around desperately for another route to her children. The main staircase was blocked by fire, the servants' passage was blocked by Williams, and jumping from a third-floor window would likely kill her even if she survived the fall. Then she remembered David's excited discovery during their afternoon exploration, the secret passage behind the with bookshelf in what he'd claimed as his bedroom. If that passage connected to other hidden routes through the house, it might provide a way to reach the tower room. Margaret ran toward David's chosen room, but Williams emerged from the servants' passage just as she reached the door. "End of the line," he said, pulling a backup weapon from his ankle holster. Blood was streaming from his broken nose, and his shirt was torn from their basement fight, but his gun hand was steady. "Time to join your husband." Margaret dove into David's room just as Williams fired, the bullet splintering the doorframe where her head had been a split second earlier. She rolled behind the bed and immediately began searching for the secret passage David had found earlier. There behind the built-in bookshelf, just as he'd described. Margaret pushed against the shelf, but it didn't budge. There had to be a release mechanism, some way to open the passage that a 5-year-old had figured out, but she was missing. Williams entered the room cautiously, his weapon trained on the bed where Margaret was hiding. "You know what I've learned in 20 years of this work," he said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather rather than her imminent murder. "Children are remarkably resilient. Emma and David will adjust to their new circumstances eventually. Kids always do." Margaret's hands found a lever hidden behind one of the books on the shelf. She pulled it, and the entire bookcase swung inward, revealing a passage that led deeper into the house's hidden architecture. "They'll cry for you at first," Williams continued, moving closer to the bed. "They'll ask when they're going home, when they'll see Mommy again. But after a few months with their new friends, they'll stop asking. They always stop asking." Margaret slipped into the passage and found herself in a network of hidden corridors that connected multiple rooms throughout the house. The passages were narrow but navigable, clearly designed for servants to move unseen through the mansion during its original construction. Behind her, she could hear Williams discovering the open passage and cursing as he realized she'd escaped again. But the passages were too narrow for a man of his size to follow quickly, and Margaret had the advantage of desperation driving her forward. She navigated by feel and instinct, following corridors that led upward and toward what she hoped was the tower room. The air in the passages was cleaner than in the main house, suggesting that the fire hadn't spread to the hidden areas yet. Finally, Margaret found a panel that opened into the tower room, where Emma and David were huddled together in exactly the spot she'd left them. They rushed into her arms, both crying with relief and fear. "Mommy, the house is on fire," Emma sobbed. "We could hear people shooting and everything was shaking and we thought you weren't coming back." "I promised I'd come back," Margaret said, holding them both as tightly as she could. "And I promise we're going to get out of here safely." But even as she spoke the words, Margaret could hear Williams moving through the house below them, and she could see through the tower room windows that the fire was spreading rapidly through the lower floors. They were trapped at the top of a burning building with a killer between them and any normal exit. Margaret looked around the tower room desperately, trying to find a solution that would save her children. The windows offered a view of the entire property, including the ongoing battle between federal agents and Williams' associates. She could see muzzle flashes in the darkness around the house's perimeter, but she couldn't tell who was winning. Then she noticed something that made her heart race with new hope. There was a communication device in the corner of the tower room, not a telephone, but what looked like an old ham radio setup. Elias Blackwood had apparently used the tower room as a communication center, and if the radio was still functional, it might provide a way to contact the outside world. Margaret quickly examined the equipment while Emma and David watched with scared but trusting eyes. The radio was old but well-maintained, and there was a laminated card next to it with emergency frequencies and call signs. She powered up the radio and began broadcasting on the emergency frequency listed for federal law enforcement. "This is Margaret Chen at 1347 Elm Street, Salem, Massachusetts. I am trapped in a burning house with my 2 children by Deputy Sheriff Williams, who has been covering up systematic child murders for 60 years. Agent Morrison, if you can hear this, we need immediate extraction from the tower room on the 3rd floor. Static filled the radio for several seconds before Agent Morrison's voice crackled through. "Margaret, this is Morrison. We've been trying to reach you. The house is surrounded by hostile forces, but we've managed to eliminate most of them. Williams is the last significant threat. He's in the house with us," Margaret replied. "The building is on fire, and I can't get my children out through the main routes. We're sending a helicopter for roof extraction," Morrison said. "Can you get to the roof from your current location?" Margaret looked around the tower room and spotted a narrow spiral staircase that led upward to what must be a roof access. "I think so. Move now," Morrison ordered. "The fire department has clearance to move in, but the structure is becoming unstable. You have maybe 10 minutes before the roof becomes too dangerous for helicopter extraction." Margaret gathered Emma and David and headed for the spiral staircase. But before they could start climbing, the tower room door burst open and Williams appeared, his face a mask of blood and rage. "Going somewhere?" he asked, pointing his gun at the children. Margaret positioned herself between Williams and her kids, but she knew there was nowhere left to run. The spiral staircase behind them led to the roof, but Williams was blocking their path. "It's over, Williams," Margaret said. "The federal agents have won. Your associates are dead or captured. The evidence is already in the hands of journalists. You can't cover this up anymore." Williams smiled, but there was nothing human in the expression. "You're right, it's over. But if I can't have your children for my customers, then nobody gets them. Sometimes the best way to clean up a mess is to make sure there are no witnesses left to testify." He raised his weapon, and Margaret knew that she and her children were about to die in a tower room overlooking a burning house, full of evil secrets. But sometimes justice, that comes from unexpected directions. The tower room's floor suddenly gave way under Williams' structural damage. From the fire compromised the old wooden supports, he fell through the collapsing floor with a scream of surprise and rage. Disappearing into the burning house below, Margaret grabbed Emma and David and rushed up the spiral staircase to the roof, emerging into cold night air just as a police helicopter appeared overhead. Below them, the Victorian house that had housed 60 years of unspeakable crimes was finally burning, with away the darkness that had protected monsters for far too long. As Margaret and her children were lifted to safety by federal agents who had spent years trying to expose the conspiracy she'd stumbled upon, she looked down at the burning mansion and thought about all the children who had died in that basement, all the families who had never known what happened to their loved ones. Justice had finally come to 1347 Elm Street, but the fight to expose everyone involved in the conspiracy was just beginning. 6 months after the burning of 1347 Elm Street, Margaret Chen sat in a secure conference room in the FBI's Boston field office, watching the final pieces of the largest criminal conspiracy in American history fall into place. Through the conference room's windows, she could see the city where she and her children had started their new life, a life built on the foundation of truth and justice that had cost them everything they'd once known. Emma and David were at their new school, a private academy where federal marshals disguised as teachers ensured their safety while high-profile arrests continued to make headlines across the country. It had taken Margaret weeks to explain to her children why they could never go back to their old life, why they needed new names and a new home, why the nightmares they still had about that burning house were the price of saving other children from the monsters who had hidden in plain sight for 60 years. Agent Sarah Morrison, to enter the conference room carrying the latest reports from field offices across 12 states. Over the past 6 months, she'd become more than Margaret's federal handler. She'd become the closest thing Margaret had to a friend in a world where almost everyone from her old life had to believe she was dead. "The final arrest warrants were executed this morning," Morrison announced, setting down a stack of files that represented hundreds of hours of investigation sparked by the evidence Margaret had found in Elias Blackwood's basement. Senator Harrison, Judge Caldwell, and Police Chief Romano were taken into custody without incident. That brings the total to 47 arrests across 6 states. Margaret looked at the list of names: politicians, judges, business leaders, law enforcement officials, all connected by their participation in a network that had systematically tortured and murdered children for the entertainment of wealthy predators. Some of the names she recognized from newspapers and television. Others were local figures whose corruption had enabled the network to operate without fear of prosecution. "What about the children?" Margaret asked. the question that haunted her every night since they'd escaped the burning house. The current victims, were we able to save them all? Morrison's expression grew both satisfied and grim. We recovered 17 children from active facilities in 4 states, all alive, all receiving treatment at secure medical facilities. The youngest was 6, the oldest 14. They're going to need years of therapy, but they're safe now. Margaret closed her eyes, thinking about the photographs she'd found scattered across the basement floor of the Blackwood house. 27 children who had died in that basement over 60 years, and 17 more who would have joined them if she hadn't. You inherited a house from a stranger and decided to investigate the loose floorboard in the basement, the families of the victims from the basement, Margaret said quietly. Have they been notified? Morrison nodded. That was the hardest part of this whole operation. Some of these children disappeared in the 1960s. We had to contact families who had spent decades wondering what happened, parents who never stopped hoping their kids would come home someday. Margaret had attended several of the meetings between FBI agents and families of the basement victims. She'd watched elderly parents learn that their children had died horribly while they'd spent decades hoping for a phone call or a letter. She'd seen the complex mixture of grief and relief that came with finally knowing the truth, even when that truth was unbearable. But they know now, Margaret said. They can finally grieve properly. They can finally say goodbye. The door to the conference room opened, and Tom Patterson, the journalist who had received Margaret's first frantic phone call from the burning house, entered with the advance copy of his book about the case. The Truth Beneath: How One Mother's Courage Exposed America's Darkest Conspiracy would be published next month, and pre-orders were already breaking records. Margaret, I wanted you to see this before it goes to print, Tom said, handing her a copy of the final chapter. I included everything you asked me to include about the victims, about their families, about making sure this never happens again. Margaret had worked closely with Tom over the past 6 months to ensure that his book would serve, not just as an expose of the conspiracy, but as a memorial to the children who had died and a warning about the institutions that had failed to protect them. She'd insisted that every victim be named, every family be honored, every failure of the system be documented so that future generations would understand how such evil had been allowed to flourish. The congressional hearings start next week, Morrison added. You'll be testifying in closed session, but your testimony will be the foundation for the most comprehensive investigation of government corruption in American history. Margaret had dreaded the congressional hearings, but she understood their necessity. The network they'd exposed hadn't just been a criminal enterprise. It had been a cancer that had metastasized through every level of government, influencing court cases, elections, and policy decisions for decades. Removing the cancer required understanding how deep it had spread. What about the other locations? Margaret asked. Elias's letter mentioned that this was bigger than just Salem. Morrison smiled grimly. International cooperation has been unprecedented. We've identified similar networks in 8 countries, all connected through financial channels and technology infrastructure. The operation in Salem was actually one of the smaller nodes in a global enterprise. The scope of what they'd uncovered still overwhelmed Margaret sometimes. What had started as a decision to investigate a loose floorboard in her inherited house had led to exposing a criminal network that spanned continents and had operated for generations. Sometimes she wondered what would have happened if she'd simply been grateful for the house and never read Elias Blackwood's letter, but then she thought about the 17 children who were alive because she decided to investigate, about the families who finally had answers about their missing loved ones, about the predators who would never hurt another child. The price of truth had been enormous, but the cost of continued ignorance would have been far worse. Emma burst into the conference room at that moment, followed by David and their federal marshal escort who doubled as their teacher. School had ended early, and the children had been brought to the FBI office for their weekly security briefing that they thought was just a boring grown-up meeting. Mummy, guess what we learned in history class today? Emma announced with the enthusiasm of an 8-year-old who didn't fully understand why her mother was famous. We learned about people who stand up to bullies even when it's scary. David, now 6 years old and more serious than any child should have to be, added. Mrs. Peterson said you're like the people in the history books who fight bad guys. Margaret hugged both her children, breathing in their innocence and their trust, grateful beyond words that they were safe and healthy and would never have to experience what the children in those basement photographs had endured. Mrs. Peterson is right, Margaret said, but the most important thing to remember is that fighting bad guys isn't something you do alone. It takes lots of good people working together. Agent Morrison had become something of an honorary aunt to Emma and David over the past 6 months, and she knelt down to their level to show them pictures from the morning's arrests. See all these police officers, she said, pointing to photos of FBI agents leading handcuffed suspects from courthouses across the country. Every one of them is helping to make sure that what happened in that scary house never happens to other children. David studied the pictures seriously. Are all the bad guys caught now? Morrison and Margaret exchanged a look over the children's heads. The truth was that networks like this were almost impossible to eliminate completely. As long as there were powerful people willing to exploit vulnerable children, And as long as there were corrupt officials willing to protect them for money or political influence, the danger would never completely disappear. But the specific network they'd exposed was broken, its leaders dead or imprisoned, its financial infrastructure destroyed, its political protection eliminated. The children were safer than they'd been in decades. The really bad guys are caught, Morrison told David. And we're working very hard to make sure no new bad guys can do what they did. Over the following hour, Margaret reviewed the final pieces of the case that had consumed their lives for 6 months. The financial investigation had revealed hundreds of millions of dollars in profits from the network's activities, money that was being distributed to victim compensation funds and organizations dedicated to finding missing children. The technology investigation had uncovered sophisticated communication and distribution systems that had allowed the network to operate globally while maintaining security that had kept law enforcement agencies from detecting their activities for decades. The political investigation had revealed the true scope of the corruption, showing how blackmail and bribery had influenced everything from court decisions to legislation to law enforcement priorities. The reforms being implemented as a result would fundamentally change how government operated at every level. But for Margaret, the most important part of the investigation was the victim identification and family notification process. Every child whose remains had been found in the basement of 1347 Elm Street had been identified through DNA analysis and decades-old missing person reports. Every family had been contacted and offered counseling services and memorial funds established in their children's names. There's one more thing, Morrison said as the official briefing concluded. The Blackwood House site. The city of Salem has asked what you want to do with the property. Margaret had thought about this question for months. The house itself was gone, destroyed in the fire that had claimed Deputy Williams and eliminated the physical location where so much evil had taken place. But the land remained, along with the basement foundation that had served as a tomb for 27 children. I want it to be a memorial, Margaret said finally. Not just for the children who died there, but for all missing children. A place where families can come to remember and to hope. Morrison nodded. The city is prepared to support whatever memorial you think is appropriate. They understand that Salem will always be associated with what happened there, and they want to make sure it's remembered in a way that honors the victims. As the meeting concluded and they prepared to return to their secure apartment, Emma asked the question that had been troubling her for weeks. Mommy, why did the bad men want to hurt children? What did children ever do to them? Margaret had dreaded this question because she knew it would come eventually, and because there was no answer that would make sense to an innocent 8. How do you explain evil to someone who doesn't understand cruelty? How do you describe predators to someone who still believes that adults exist to protect children? Some people are broken inside, Margaret said carefully. They want to hurt others because hurting people makes them feel powerful. But Emma, the most important thing to remember is that there are many more good people than bad people in the world. For every person who wants to hurt children, there are hundreds of people who want to protect them. David, always practical, asked, how do we know who the good people are? Margaret thought about Agent Morrison, who had risked her career to coordinate the investigation, about Tom Patterson, who had sacrificed months of his life to ensure the truth was told properly, about the federal agents who had stormed a burning house to save them, about the social workers and therapists who were helping the rescued children heal, about the congressional representatives who were working to reform the systems that had failed for so long. Good people are the ones who help others, Margaret told her son. Good people are the ones who speak up when they see something wrong, even when speaking up is scary. Good people are the ones who protect children instead of hurting them. That evening, after Emma and David had gone to bed in their new bedrooms in their secure apartment, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and a letter she'd been writing for weeks. It was addressed to the families of every child who had died in the basement of 1347 Elm Street, and she'd struggled with finding the right words to express her grief for their losses and her determination to ensure their children's deaths would lead to meaningful change. The letter read, "To the families of the children we found. My name is Margaret Chen, and I am the woman who inherited the house where your children died. I want you to know that finding them was the most heartbreaking and important thing that has ever happened in my life. I want you to know that your children's deaths were not meaningless. Because of what they endured, we were able to expose a network of creditors that had been operating for 60 years. Because of what happened to them, 17 other children are alive today who would have died if we hadn't found the evidence in that basement. I want you to know that your children are not forgotten. Every day, investigators are working on cases inspired by what we learned from their deaths. Every day, legislation is being passed to protect vulnerable children because lawmakers understand what happens when the system fails. I want you to know that justice is being served. The people who killed your children are dead or imprisoned. The people who protected those killers are being prosecuted. The systems that allowed this to happen are being reformed. But most importantly, I want you to know that your children saved other children's lives. Their deaths, as tragic and senseless as they were, became the key to stopping monsters who would have continued killing if we hadn't found the truth beneath that house. I hope that brings you some small measure of peace. I hope you know that they did not die in vain. I promise you that as long as I live, I will continue fighting to protect children and to ensure that what happened to your babies never happens to anyone else's children. With love and respect for your loss, Margaret Chen. As Margaret sealed the letter and prepared to send copies to all 43 families they'd been able to identify, she thought about how different her life was now compared to 6 months ago. She'd been a struggling single mother working in a library, worried about paying rent and keeping her children fed. Now she was one of the most protected witnesses in federal custody, living under an assumed name while the most important criminal cases in American history proceeded through the courts. But some things hadn't changed. She was still a mother, still devoted to protecting Emma and David and ensuring they had the best possible future. She was still a researcher, still passionate about uncovering truth and preserving history. She was still someone who believed that justice mattered, that the vulnerable deserved protection, that speaking up was worth any risk. The only real difference was that now she knew what she was capable of when everything she cared about was threatened. She'd learned that maternal love was the most powerful force in the world. Stronger than corruption, stronger than money, stronger than the monsters who thought they were untouchable. A year later, Margaret stood in a small park in Salem, Massachusetts, watching as workers installed the final piece of the memorial that had been built on the site where 1347 Elm Street once stood. The memorial was simple but profound, a garden with 27 trees, one for each child who had died in the basement, surrounded by benches where families could sit and remember. In the center of the garden was a sculpture of children playing, their faces turned toward the sun, their expressions joyful and innocent. At the base of the sculpture was a plaque that read, "In memory of the children who died here, and in hope for all children everywhere. May their deaths lead to better protection for the vulnerable, and may their memory inspire us never to look away from evil, no matter how powerful or protected it appears to be." Emma and David helped plant flowers around their favorite tree, while Margaret watched families of the victims arrive for the memorial's dedication. Some were elderly couples who had spent decades wondering what happened to their children. Others were siblings who had grown up wondering about brothers and sisters who had vanished. All of them were finally able to say goodbye properly. As the dedication ceremony began, Margaret thought about Elias Blackwood's letter, about his belief that she had the strength to handle what he'd discovered and the integrity to do the right thing with it. She thought about her husband Michael, whose own investigation into the conspiracy had led to his death but had ultimately guided her to the truth. She thought about the network of evil that had operated for 60 years, protected by money and power and the willingness of good people to look the other way. And she thought about how quickly that network had crumbled once the truth was exposed, once people understood what had been happening in the shadows. The most important lesson Margaret had learned was that evil flourishes when good people remain silent, but it cannot survive when truth is spoken with courage and determination. The children who had died in that basement had finally received justice, and the children who were still alive were safer because their deaths had not been meaningless. As the sun set over the memorial garden, Margaret gathered Emma and David close to her and walked toward their car, ready to continue the life they'd built together on the foundation of truth and justice. The house at 1347 Elm Street was gone, but its legacy would endure in the form of laws passed to protect children, systems reformed to prevent corruption, and families who finally knew what happened to their loved ones. Margaret Chen had inherited more than just a house from Elias Blackwood. She'd inherited the responsibility to speak for children who could no longer speak for themselves, and she'd proven worthy of that trust. The secret beneath the floorboards had finally seen the light of day, and that light would continue shining long after the last of the conspirators had faced justice. Some houses hide secrets that change the world, but in the end, love and courage proved stronger than any conspiracy, and truth proved more powerful than any attempt to bury it. The children were finally home,